I never thought at 72 I'd be questioning whether I was invisible in my own son's life. Yesterday, Clara walked into my kitchen, looked right past the orchids I'd been nurturing for months, and announced she needed my help with something important. 6 years of subtle dismissals, 6 years of being treated like an outdated relic in my own home, 6 years of watching my son pretend not to notice. Now, suddenly, she needed the connections I'd built over my 40-year academic career. But here's what Clara doesn't know about the reference letter she's asking for. Would you believe that the woman reviewing her application has been my closest friend for over 30 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I suppose I should start at the beginning, though beginnings in stories like mine aren't always clear-cut. When you've lived 72 years, the threads of your life weave together in ways that make it hard to say where one chapter ends and another begins. But if I had to pinpoint when this particular story took root, it would be 17 years ago, when Arthur's heart gave out on a Tuesday morning while he was watering the tomatoes in our backyard garden. Arthur always said our townhouse on Ashland Avenue looked like something out of a fairy tale, with its ivy-covered brick walls and the way the morning light filtered through the old oak tree in our front yard. He wasn't wrong. Even now, sitting in my kitchen with my hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea, I can feel the house breathing around me, alive with memories and the gentle rustle of the dozens of plants that have made this place their home. The kitchen has always been the heart of our home. Arthur designed it himself back in 1978, with deep windowsills, perfect for herbs and small flowering plants. The countertops are butcher block, worn smooth by decades of meal preparation, and the walls are painted a warm cream that catches the light just so. My collection of botanical prints hangs in neat rows above the breakfast nook, each one a reminder of some expedition or discovery from my years teaching environmental science at Northwestern. I've lived alone here since Arthur passed, and in many ways, I've grown to love the solitude. My days have a rhythm that suits me: morning coffee while reading the Tribune, tending to my plants, preparing lectures for the community classes I teach at the Garfield Park Conservatory, and evenings spent reading in Arthur's old leather chair in the living room. The chair still smells faintly of his aftershave, though I suspect that's more memory than reality at this point. My son Evan was 21 when his father died, just graduated from college and starting his first job as a software engineer. He's always been a gentle soul, more like Arthur than me in temperament, though he inherited my stubborn streak when it comes to things he cares about. 4 years after Arthur's death, it was just the two of us figuring out how to be a family without our anchor. Evan would come by every Sunday for dinner, and we'd sit in the garden talking about his work, his friends, his hopes for the future. Those were good years, quiet but fulfilling. I threw myself into my teaching and research, publishing papers on urban ecosystem restoration and mentoring graduate students who reminded me why I fell in love with botany in the first place. There's something magical about watching young minds discover the intricate connections between plants and their environments, the way a single change in soil pH can affect an entire ecosystem, or how certain flowers have evolved specifically to attract particular pollinators. I retired at 65, not because I had to, but because I wanted to focus on community education and spend more time in my garden. The transition wasn't easy. After 40 years of university life, the sudden quiet felt almost oppressive. But I found my footing through the conservatory work, teaching neighborhood kids and adults about plant care, sustainable gardening, and the importance of green spaces in urban environments. It was during this period of adjustment that Evan started dating seriously. There had been girlfriends before, of course, but none that lasted more than a few months. Then he met Clara at some corporate networking event downtown. She worked in marketing for a tech startup, he told me, and she was ambitious, driven, exactly the kind of woman who could keep up with his career aspirations. I remember the first time he brought her home for dinner. It was a crisp October evening, and I'd spent the afternoon preparing Arthur's favorite pot roast recipe, the one with the root vegetables from our garden. I was nervous, I'll admit. It had been 3 years since Evan had introduced me to anyone. He was dating, and something in his voice when he talked about Clara suggested this one was different. She arrived wearing a sleek black dress and heels that clicked authoritatively on our hardwood floors. Her handshake was firm, her smile polished, and she complimented the house in the way people do when they're being professionally pleasant. "What a charming little place," she said, her eyes scanning the living room with its collection of botanical books, Arthur's reading chair, and the small forest of plants that crowd every available surface. During dinner, Clara talked about her work with an enthusiasm that was genuinely infectious. She specialized in digital marketing for sustainable brands, she explained, helping companies communicate their environmental initiatives to consumers. "It was work that mattered," she said, work that could make a real difference in how people thought about their relationship with the planet. I found myself drawn into the conversation, sharing stories from my own research into urban sustainability initiatives. Clara listened politely, asking appropriate questions, but I noticed a certain quality to her attention, the way someone listens when they're being courteous rather than genuinely interested. When I mentioned a paper I'd published on the role of community gardens in urban food security, she nodded and said, "That's fascinating. It's so important to preserve these traditional approaches to environmental stewardship." Traditional approaches. The phrase stung a little, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. My research wasn't traditional, it was cutting-edge work on adaptive ecosystem management in urban environments. But something in Clara's tone suggested she saw it as quaint, a relic from an early era of environmentalism. Still, I was determined to make a good impression. Evan clearly cared about her, and I could see why. She was intelligent, articulate, and passionate about her work. As the evening progressed, I found myself working harder to engage her, asking about her projects, sharing stories I thought might interest her, offering to show her the garden. "Oh, that's sweet of you," she said when I suggested a tour of the backyard, "but these hills weren't really designed for garden walking." Maybe next time. There was something in her laugh that felt dismissive, though Evan didn't seem to notice. He was watching her with the kind of adoration that reminded me of how Arthur used to look at me in our early days together. Young love has its own blindness, I suppose. As they prepared to leave, Clara thanked me for the lovely home-cooked meal, in a tone that suggested such things were charming, but impractical in her world of takeout and restaurant dining. She complimented my hobby with the plants, and mentioned how nice it must be to have so much time for gardening now that I was retired. After they left, I sat in Arthur's chair and tried to shake off a vague sense of unease. Clara seemed nice enough, and Evan was clearly smitten. Perhaps I was being oversensitive, reading too much into casual comments and polite small talk. After all, she was young and busy, from a different generation with different priorities. It was natural that we might not immediately connect. But as the months passed and Clara became a regular fixture at our Sunday dinners, that initial feeling crystallized into something more concrete. It wasn't anything she said outright. Clara was far too sophisticated for overt rudeness. Instead, it was 1,000 small moments that accumulated like sediment in still water. She would arrive at dinner parties empty-handed while commenting on how quaint it was that I still cooked from scratch. She'd redirect conversations when I shared stories from my teaching days, smoothly steering the discussion toward more current topics. When I offered advice based on my experience, she'd listen with the patronizing attention one might give to a child's elaborate fantasy game. Most painfully, she began to position herself as Evan's primary family, making plans for holidays and special occasions without consulting me, then graciously including me in decisions about how we'd spend time together. "Helen won't mind if we do Christmas at our place this year," she'd say to Evan, as if I weren't sitting right there. It'll be so much easier for her not to have to cook. The truth was, I loved cooking for Christmas. The elaborate meals, the carefully set table, the tradition of serving Arthur's mother's trifle recipe. These things anchored the holiday for me, connected me to the family rituals that had sustained us through decades of celebration. But when I tried to express this, Clara would pat my arm and say something about how I deserved to take it easy at my age. Evan, bless him, seemed oblivious to the subtle power struggle playing out in his kitchen. He wanted the two most important women in his life to get along, and Clara was careful to maintain the appearance of warmth and respect when he was paying attention. It was only in the small moments, the eye rolls when I told a story he'd heard before, the way she'd check her phone when I spoke, the subtle corrections of my outdated views on everything from technology to social issues, that her true feelings showed. I began to feel like a stranger in my own son's life, tolerated rather than welcomed, humored rather than heard. The woman who had spent for decades shaping young minds, who had published research that influenced environmental policy in 3 major cities, who had raised a son to be kind and thoughtful and successful, was being treated like a well-meaning, but irrelevant elderly relative. And the most heartbreaking part was watching Evan unconsciously absorb Clara's attitude toward me. He stopped asking for my opinion on important decisions. He began apologizing for my old-fashioned ways when Clara made subtle digs about my cooking or my house or my habits. He started treating me with the careful gentleness one reserves for the elderly and fragile. Even though at 72 I was sharper and more energetic than many people half my age. This is the world I was living in when Clara knocked on my door yesterday morning. Her usually perfect composure cracked just enough to reveal the desperation underneath. The woman who had spent 6 years making me feel small and irrelevant was standing in my kitchen, asking for my help. The morning Clara came to me for help started like any other Thursday. I was deadheading the geraniums on my kitchen windowsill when I heard the sharp knock on my front door. Not the gentle tap of our neighbour or the familiar rhythm of Evan's arrival, but something more urgent, more demanding. I dried my hands on my gardening apron and walked through the living room, noting the way the morning light caught the dust motes dancing above Arthur's chair. Through the frosted glass panel beside the door, I could make out Clara's silhouette, though she rarely visited without Evan, and never on a weekday morning. When I opened the door, she was standing on my front step in her usual armour of professional perfection, a tailored navy blazer, crisp white blouse, and those intimidating heels that made her tower over me. But something was different in her posture, a tension in her shoulders that her expensive clothing couldn't quite hide. "Helen," she said, and there was something in her voice I'd never heard before, uncertainty, maybe even vulnerability. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" I stepped aside to let her in, noting the way she glanced around the living room as if seeing it for the first time. Her usual confident stride seemed slightly off balance as she navigated around the collection of plant stands and stacks of gardening magazines that had accumulated over the winter. "Of course," I said, leading her toward the kitchen. "Can I make you some coffee? Tea? Coffee would be wonderful." She followed me into the kitchen, her heels clicking against the worn hardwood floors. I noticed she was carrying her leather portfolio, the expensive one she used for important business meetings. As I prepared the coffee, Clara perched on the edge of one of my kitchen chairs, her back straight and hands folded in her lap like a job applicant waiting for an interview. The morning light streaming through my herb garden on the windowsill cast dancing shadows across her face, and I could see the careful makeup couldn't quite conceal the dark circles under her eyes. "I suppose you're wondering why I'm here," she said as I set a steaming mug in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it as if seeking warmth, though the kitchen was perfectly comfortable. "I'm curious," I admitted, settling into my own chair. Across from her, the kitchen table was small, intimate, forcing a closeness that seemed to make Clara even more uncomfortable than usual. Between us sat Arthur's reading glasses, abandoned from my morning newspaper reading, and a small parted African violet that had been blooming enthusiastically for weeks. Clara took a careful sip of her coffee, then set the mug down with the precise control of someone trying very hard to appear calm. "Helen, I need to ask you for a favor, a professional favor." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. In 6 years of knowing Clara, she had never asked me for anything. In fact, she had made it abundantly clear that she considered my professional life to be ancient history, my expertise outdated, my connections irrelevant to the modern world she inhabited. "What kind of favor?" I asked. Though something in my chest was already tightening with anticipation, Clara opened her portfolio and withdrew a folder, her movements precise, but betraying a slight tremor in her hands. "There's a position that's opened up, a director role at the Midwest Environmental Action Network." It's everything I've been working toward, Helen, the opportunity to make real change, to be part of something that matters. I knew the organization well. MEAN was one of the most respected environmental non-profits in the region, known for their innovative approach to community-based conservation and their ability to bridge the gap between academic research and practical policy implementation. Their current director, Dr. Elise Navarro, had been my colleague and friend for over 30 years. It sounds like an excellent opportunity, I said carefully, wondering where this conversation was heading. It is. Clara leaned forward slightly, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the hunger underneath. The problem is, it's incredibly competitive. They're looking for someone with not just marketing and communications experience, but deep connections in the environmental science community. Someone who understands both the theoretical and practical sides of conservation work. She paused, taking another sip of coffee, and I could see her gathering herself for whatever came next. I have all the marketing credentials they're looking for, she continued. 5 years of experience building sustainable brand narratives, a track record of successful campaigns, glowing references from every client I've worked with. But what I don't have is the academic credibility, the research background that would give my application weight with their selection committee. I nodded, beginning to understand where this was going, though I could hardly believe it. Double quotes Helen. I know we don't always see eye to eye on things, Clara said, and this might have been the understatement of the century, but I also know that you have exactly the kind of background they're looking for. 40 years in environmental science, published research, connections throughout the academic community. If someone like you were to write me a reference letter, it would carry enormous weight with their selection committee. The audacity of it took my breath away. For 6 years, this woman had treated my career as if it were a charming hobby from a bygone era. She had dismissed my expertise, patronized my knowledge, and made me feel like a relic gathering dust in the corner of Evan's life. And now, when she needed something from me, suddenly my credentials were worth acknowledging. I set down my coffee mug and studied her face. Clara was watching me with the intensity of someone whose entire future hung in the balance, though she was trying to maintain her usual composure. The morning light revealed tiny stress lines around her eyes that I'd never noticed before, and there was something almost desperate in the way she held herself. Clara, I said slowly, help me understand something. 4 years now, you've made it quite clear that you consider my work to be outdated. My approach to environmental science traditional to the point of irrelevance. Just last month, when I mentioned the paper I'd published on urban ecosystem restoration, you said it was important to preserve these historical perspectives on environmentalism. Why would you want a reference from someone whose work you considered historical? A flush crept up Clara's neck, staining her carefully applied foundation. She set down her coffee mug with slightly more force than necessary, the porcelain clicking against the wooden table. Double quotes Helen. I think you may have misunderstood. Have I interrupted gently, because I distinctly remember you telling Evan that it was sweet how I kept myself busy with my little plant projects now that I was retired. And when Dr. Martinez from the university called last spring to ask me to consult on the new urban forestry initiative, you mentioned how nice it was that they were giving emeritus professors courtesy roles to help them feel useful. Clara's composure was cracking now, her professional mask slipping to reveal something raw and panicked underneath. Helen, I never meant to imply that your work wasn't valuable. If I gave that impression, I sincerely apologize. The truth is, I've always admired your career, your expertise. Sometimes I struggle with how to relate to your generation's approach to things. My generation's approach, I repeated, and there was steel in my voice that surprised even Clara, I published my most cited paper 3 years ago. The urban ecosystem management model I developed is being implemented in 12 cities across the Midwest. My generation's approach seems to be working quite well for current environmental challenges. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Clara stared down at her hands, her carefully manicured fingers gripping the coffee mug like a lifeline. When she looked up again, there were tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. You're right, she said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I've been ... I haven't been fair to you. I know that. And I know I have no right to ask you for this favor after how I've treated you. But Helen, this job ... it's everything I've worked for. It's my chance to actually make a difference instead of just talking about making a difference. There was something in her voice that struck me despite everything, a genuine passion that reminded me of myself at her age, hungry to prove I belonged in a field dominated by older, more established voices. But that sympathy was complicated by 6 years of accumulated slights, of being made to feel invisible in my own son's life. Tell me about the position, I said, not committing to anything, but needing to understand what she was really asking of me. Relief flooded Clara's face, and she immediately became more animated, pulling papers from her portfolio. It's a director level position overseeing their community outreach and education programs. I'd be responsible for developing marketing strategies that translate complex environmental research into accessible public campaigns. It's exactly the kind of work I've been training for, using communication skills to bridge the gap between scientists and the general public. As she described the role, I had to admit it sounded like a perfect fit for her skills, despite everything. Between us, I couldn't deny that Clara was talented at what she did. I'd seen the campaign she'd developed for her current clients, the way she could take dry research data and transform it into compelling narratives that motivated people to action. The selection committee is headed by Dr. Elise Navarro, Clara continued, and my heart skipped a beat. She's this legendary figure in environmental science, someone who's been pioneering community-based conservation approaches for decades. Having a reference from someone in her circle would be incredibly powerful, if only she knew, I thought. Elise and I had been colleagues since graduate school, had co-authored papers, had supported each other through the challenges of being women in a male-dominated field. We still talked regularly, had lunch at least once a month, and I'd been following MEAN's work closely because of Elise's involvement, but I didn't tell Clara any of that. Not yet, Clara, I said instead. Writing a reference letter is serious business. It's putting my reputation behind your qualifications, vouching for your character and abilities to colleagues whose respect I value enormously. Given our ... history ... I need to think about whether I can honestly do that. Something flickered in Clara's eyes. Hurt, maybe, or fear. I understand, she said quietly. I know I haven't given you many reasons to want to help me, but Helen, I'm asking you to look beyond our personal issues and consider what I could accomplish in this role. The environmental movement needs people who can communicate effectively with younger generations, who understand modern marketing and social media strategies. I could be really valuable to their mission. She wasn't wrong about that, and we both knew it. But the irony wasn't lost on me that she was now arguing for the value of bridging generational gaps in environmentalism, when she'd spent years treating me like a relic from a bygone era. I need time to think about this, I said finally. Clara nodded, gathering her papers with hands that shook slightly. Of course. How much time do you need? The application deadline is next Friday, so I'd need the letter by early next week at the latest. I'll let you know by Monday, I promised Dodd as I walked her to the door. Clara turned back to me, her professional mask completely gone now. Helen, I know I don't deserve your help. But if you could find it in yourself to write this letter, I would be so grateful, more grateful than you know. After she left, I stood in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the spot where she'd sat. The morning light had shifted, and the African violet on the table seemed to glow in the gentle illumination. Arthur's reading glasses caught the light too, and I found myself thinking about what he would say about this situation. Arthur had always believed in the power of second chances, in the importance of grace over grudges. But he'd also taught me to value myself, to never let anyone diminish my worth or my voice. Helen, he used to say when I'd come home frustrated from faculty meetings where my ideas had been dismissed or ignored, don't let them make you smaller. Then you are, your voice matters. Now Clara was asking me to use that voice on her behalf, after spending years trying to silence it. The question wasn't whether I could write the letter. I could, and it would carry significant weight with Elise and the selection committee. The question was whether I should, and what message that would send about the value of treating people with respect. I picked up Arthur's glasses and held them up to the light. watching the way the lenses caught and bent the morning sunshine. Somewhere in this situation was a lesson about power, about dignity, about the complicated calculus of forgiveness and justice. But I wasn't ready to solve that equation yet. First, I needed to think. And maybe I needed to have a conversation with an old friend about the future of environmental activism and the importance of choosing the right people to carry that work forward. I spent the rest of Thursday in my garden, which is where I always go when I need to think clearly. There's something about having my hands in soil, about the simple act of nurturing growing things, that helps me sort through complicated emotions and find my way to truth. The afternoon was unseasonably warm for early March in Chicago, and I could already see the first green shoots of daffodils pushing through the mulch along the back fence. Spring has always been my favorite season, not just for the obvious beauty of things coming back to life, but for what it represents about resilience, about the way life finds a way to continue even after the harshest winters. As I worked, pulling weeds from around the emerging perennials and checking the soil moisture in my raised beds, my mind kept circling back to Clara's visit. The more I thought about it, the more complicated the situation became. On one hand, there was the simple matter of justice. Clara had treated me poorly for years, and now she wanted my help. It would be perfectly reasonable to refuse, to let her face the consequences of her own actions. But on the other hand, there was the larger question of what was best for the environmental movement. If Clara truly was the right person for this position, if she could bring valuable skills to important work, did I have the right to let personal grievances stand in the way of that? The climate crisis wasn't going to wait for us to sort out our interpersonal drama. I was wrestling with these thoughts when I heard my back gate creak open. I looked up from my kneeling position beside the compost bins to see Jasmine Lane picking her way carefully across the flagstone path in her worn sneakers, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the cafe down the street. "I brought you a peace offering," Jazz called out, holding up one of the cups. "I figured you might need some caffeine after this morning's Conservation Committee meeting ran so long." I smiled and accepted the coffee gratefully. Jazz had been volunteering at the Garfield Park Conservatory for almost 2 years now, ever since she'd enrolled in my community botany classes as a 26-year-old trying to figure out what to do with her life. She was working toward a degree in plant biology at the community college, taking classes part-time while supporting herself with various jobs around the neighborhood. What I loved most about Jazz was her genuine curiosity and her complete lack of pretension. She asked thoughtful questions, listened carefully to the answers, and treated every plant like it had something important to teach her. In many ways, she reminded me of myself at that age, eager to learn, passionate about the natural world, and slightly impatient with people who didn't share that passion. "How did the meeting go?" I asked, settling onto the wooden bench Arthur had built along the back fence. Jazz sat beside me, tucking one leg under herself in that unconsciously flexible way of young people. "Oh, you know how it is with committee meetings," she said, rolling her eyes. 45 minutes of arguing about budget allocations for 15 minutes of actual decision-making. But we did finally approve funding for the new children's program, so that's something. Jazz was one of the driving forces behind the conservatory's expansion into neighborhood schools, developing curricula that taught kids about urban ecology and sustainable gardening practices. Her enthusiasm for the work was infectious, and she had a gift for connecting with children that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with teaching in the first place. "Speaking of which," she continued, "I wanted to run something by you. There's this marketing expert who's been volunteering her time to help us develop promotional materials for the school program. She's really talented, sophisticated understanding of social media, great instincts for visual design. But there's something about her that rubs me the wrong way." My coffee cup paused halfway to my lips. "Oh, I can't quite put my finger on it," Jazz said, frowning slightly. "She's perfectly professional, always has great ideas, never misses a deadline. But there's this way she talks about the kids we work with, like they're a problem to be solved, rather than people with their own knowledge and experiences. And she keeps suggesting we modernize our approach, as if caring about plants and understanding ecosystems is somehow old-fashioned." "What's her name?" I asked, though I was already fairly certain I knew the answer. Clara something. Clara Hastings. I think. She mentioned she's dating someone whose mother volunteers here, but I haven't figured out that connection yet. I nearly choked on my coffee. In all the time I'd known Clara, she had never once mentioned volunteering at the conservatory. She'd never even shown interest in visiting when I'd invited her to see the work we were doing there. Jazz, I said carefully. How long has Clara been volunteering with you? Oh, maybe 6 months now. She approached us right after we got that grant from the city for the school outreach program. Said she wanted to donate her professional expertise to a good cause. Jazz paused, studying my face. Helen, do you know her? You look like you've seen a ghost. I set down my coffee cup and tried to process this information. Clara had been volunteering at the conservatory for 6 months. Essentially, the entire time I'd been developing the new children's programming that had become one of my most meaningful projects. She had access to all our planning documents, our strategic discussions, our ideas about community engagement and educational approaches. Yes, I said slowly. I know Clara. She's dating my son. Jazz's eyes widened. Your son, the software engineer. You're always talking about, but I thought. Wait, she never mentioned that connection. In fact, when people talk about you, she never says anything about knowing you personally. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and the picture they formed made my stomach clench with a mixture of anger and hurt. Clara had been using her volunteer work at the conservatory to build exactly the kind of community-based environmental credentials she would need for the main position. She'd been learning from the programs I helped develop, gaining experience with the kind of grassroots education work that was central to MEAN's mission. And she'd done it all without ever acknowledging our connection, without ever giving me credit for the work that was informing her own professional development. Jazz, I said, tell me more about Clara's work with the conservatory. What kinds of projects has she been involved with? Well, she's been helping develop our social media strategy, creating materials that explain complex ecological concepts in accessible ways. She's also been working on the community partnership initiatives, building relationships with local schools and community centres. Jazz paused, looking concerned. Helen, is everything okay? You seem upset. I was more than upset. I was beginning to understand the full scope of what had been happening. Clara hadn't just been dismissive of my work. She'd been actively benefiting from it while keeping that connection hidden from her new colleagues at the conservatory. Can you show me some of the materials she's developed? I asked. Jazz pulled out her phone and started scrolling through the conservatory's social media accounts. As she showed me Clara's work, I had to admit it was impressive. The graphics were clean and engaging, the language accessible but scientifically accurate. She had a real talent for taking complex ecological concepts and presenting them in ways that would resonate with busy parents and skeptical teenagers. But as I looked more closely, I began to recognize ideas and approaches that had come directly from my own teaching materials. The way she framed discussions about urban biodiversity, the specific examples she used to illustrate plant-community relationships, even some of the language she used, it all felt familiar because I'd been developing these approaches for the past 2 years. This is really excellent work, I said honestly, handing Jazz's phone back to her. Clara is very talented. She is, Jazz agreed, though there was still something troubled in her expression. But Helen, there's something else that's been bothering me about her involvement. She keeps talking about how the conservatory needs to evolve its educational approach, how we need to move beyond traditional methods of environmental education. It makes me feel like she thinks what we've been doing is somehow inadequate or outdated. There was that word again, traditional. Clara seemed to love using it to describe anything that didn't originate with her generation, as if 40 years of environmental science research could be dismissed as quaint historical curiosity. Jazz, has Clara ever mentioned her professional background, what she does for her day job? She said she works in marketing for sustainable brands, but she talks about wanting to transition into nonprofit work. She's actually been asking a lot of questions about how to get connected with larger environmental organizations, what kind of credentials they look for, how to make the jump from corporate work to mission-driven organizations. The picture was becoming clearer and more infuriating by the minute. Clara had been using her volunteer position at the conservatory as a kind of informal internship, gaining experience and building connections that would strengthen her application. For positions like the one at Maine, she'd been learning from my programs while simultaneously working to position herself as someone who could improve upon my supposedly outdated approaches. "Helen," Jazz said gently, "I can see this is upsetting you." "What's going on?" I took a deep breath and tried to figure out how much to share. Jazz had become a friend, as well as a colleague, someone I trusted with both professional and personal confidences, but this situation with Clara was complicated by family dynamics that made it hard to discuss objectively. "Clara asked me for a favor this morning," I said finally. "A professional favor that would significantly help her career. But our relationship has been challenging. I'm trying to figure out what the right thing to do is." Jazz nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds complicated, but can I ask you something? In all the time Clara has been volunteering with us, she's never once mentioned that she knows you personally. Don't you think that's strange? I mean, you're one of the most respected people associated with the conservatory. If I were dating your son, I'd be bragging about that connection to everyone." She was right, and the realization stung. Clara had been careful to keep our relationship secret from her new colleagues at the conservatory, probably because acknowledging it would have undermined her narrative about bringing fresh, modern perspectives to environmental education. She couldn't position herself as an innovative voice for change if people knew she was learning from the supposedly traditional approaches she was criticizing. "Jazz, can I ask you to do something for me? Can you be my eyes and ears at the conservatory for the next week or so? I'd like to know more about Clara's involvement there, what she's been working on, how she talks about the organization and its mission." "Of course," Jazz said immediately. "But Helen, is there anything I should be worried about? I mean, if Clara is dating your son, she's going to be part of your life whether we like it or not, right?" That was the question that had been haunting me since Clara left my kitchen that morning. For 6 years, I'd been tolerating her treatment of me for Evan's sake, swallowing my hurt and frustration to keep peace in the family. But this situation was bigger than just personal slights and generational misunderstandings. This was about professional integrity, about giving credit where credit was due, about the responsibility that came with the power to influence someone's career. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I really don't know." That evening, I called Elise Navarro. We'd been friends for so long that we rarely bothered with pleasantries when we talked. Just launched into whatever was on our minds with the comfort of people who'd shared enough history to skip the social niceties. "Elise," I said when she picked up, "I need to ask you about the director position you're hiring for at MEAN, the community outreach role. What about it? Who's on your selection committee? What are you looking for in candidates?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Helen, please tell me you're not thinking of coming out of retirement. Because while I would love to have you on the team, I'm not sure the budget could handle your salary expectations." I laughed. "Despite everything, no, nothing like that. But I might know someone who's applying, and I wanted to understand what you're looking for." "Well, we need someone who can bridge the gap between academic research and community engagement. Someone who understands both the science and the communication side of environmental work. Experience with social media and digital marketing is important, but so is credibility with our research partners and funding organizations. What about references? How much weight do they carry in your selection process?" "Enormous weight," Elise said immediately. "We've learned over the years that technical skills can be taught, but character and work ethic can't. A strong reference from someone we trust and respect can make or break an application." My heart was beating faster. And if that reference came from someone with deep connections in the environmental science community, someone whose judgment you trusted completely. "Helen, what exactly are you asking me?" I took a deep breath. "Hypothetically, if I were to write a reference letter for a candidate, how much influence would that have on your decision?" There was a long silence, and when Elise spoke again, her voice was serious. "Helen, a reference from you would carry enormous weight with our entire selection committee. Your reputation in this field is unparalleled. If you vouch for someone's Qualifications and character, we take that very seriously indeed. Even if that person had no formal academic background in environmental science. If you said they were qualified, we'd believe you. Helen, why are you asking me this? Are you thinking of recommending someone? Maybe, I said. I need to think about it some more. Well, don't think too long. The application deadline is next Friday, and we're hoping to make a decision quickly. The right candidate could really transform our community outreach efforts. After I hung up, I sat in Arthur's chair and stared out at the garden in the gathering. Darkness, the security light in the neighbour's yard cast strange shadows across my raised beds, making familiar shapes look foreign and mysterious. I had the power to change Clara's life with a single letter. A recommendation from me would almost certainly get her the job she wanted, the career opportunity she'd been working toward. But did she deserve that kind of help from me? And more importantly, did the environmental movement deserve to have someone who'd built her qualifications while hiding her connections and dismissing the expertise of others? Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The questions felt too big for one person to answer alone, but I knew I had to try. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself replaying moments from the past 6 years. Clara's subtle dismissals, her patronizing comments, the way she'd slowly but systematically made me feel invisible in my own son's life. But I also kept thinking about what Jazz had told me about Clara's work at the conservatory, about the talent and dedication she'd shown there. By Friday morning, I knew I needed more information before I could make any decision about the reference letter. I needed to understand exactly what Clara had been doing at the conservatory, and I needed to see for myself how she interacted with the community there. I arrived at the Garfield Park Conservatory earlier than usual, using my key to let myself into the education building before the staff arrived. The conservatory was one of my favorite places in Chicago, a stunning collection of glass houses filled with plants from around the world, surrounded by community gardens and educational spaces that serve the West Side neighborhoods. I'd been volunteering there for almost 7 years now, ever since my retirement from Northwestern. What started as a way to stay connected to my field had become one of the most meaningful parts of my life. Teaching community members about sustainable gardening, helping kids discover the wonder of plant life, working with neighbors to create green spaces in food desserts, this work felt more immediate and impactful than any academic paper I'd ever published. As I prepared materials for the day's school visit, I found myself thinking about why this place mattered so much to me. It wasn't just about the plants, though I love being surrounded by growing things. It was about the people, the single mothers learning to grow vegetables in small spaces, the teenagers who discovered they had a gift for nurturing living things, the elderly neighbors who found community and purpose in our shared garden plots. This was what environmental science looked like when it left the university and entered the real world. This was where theory met practice, where research became action, where the abstract concept of ecosystem health translated into concrete improvements in people's lives. Around 9 o'clock, Jazz arrived with a group of third graders from the nearby elementary school. I watched from across the room as she led them through the tropical plants, encouraging them to touch the fuzzy leaves of the lamb's ear and smell the herbs in the kitchen garden. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and the kids responded to her energy with the kind of wide-eyed wonder that reminded me why environmental education mattered. But what struck me most was how Jazz talked to the children. She didn't talk down to them or oversimplify complex concepts. Instead, she treated them as capable learners with their own insights and experiences to contribute. When one little girl mentioned that her grandmother grew collard greens in their backyard, Jazz immediately connected that to the larger discussion about urban food systems and community resilience. This was exactly the kind of educational approach I'd been developing over my years at the conservatory: respectful, inclusive, grounded in the knowledge and experiences that people brought to the learning environment. It was also, I realized with growing frustration, exactly the approach that Clara had been describing as traditional and in need of modernization. Around 10:30, I saw Clara arrive. She was dressed more casually than usual, dark jeans, a silk blouse, and practical flats that would work better for walking around the conservatory than her usual heels. She carried the same leather portfolio from yesterday, along with a professional-looking camera. I positioned myself behind a large ficus tree where I could observe without being seen. Clara made her way to the education classroom where Jazz was, now working with the children on a hands-on planting project. I watched as she introduced herself to the teacher, explained that she was documenting the conservatory's educational programs, and asked permission to take photos. What I saw over the next hour was interesting and deeply troubling. Clara was indeed talented at her work. She had an eye for compelling images and seemed to understand how to capture the energy and engagement of the children's learning experience. But there was something clinical about her approach, as if she was studying the program from the outside rather than participating in it. When one of the children asked her about the plants they were working with, Clara deferred to Jazz rather than engaging directly. When the teacher mentioned how much the kids had learned from previous visits, Clara nodded politely, but didn't follow up with questions about what specifically had resonated with them. She was documenting the program, but she wasn't really connecting with its mission or its participants. Most troubling was a conversation I overheard between Clara and the classroom teacher during a break in the activities. The teacher was praising the conservatory's approach, mentioning how much more engaged her students were with hands-on environmental learning compared to traditional classroom lessons about ecology. "It's wonderful that you're providing these kinds of experiences," Clara said, "though I do think there are opportunities to make the programming even more relevant to today's students. Kids this age are so digital native. There might be ways to incorporate more technology, more interactive media, to really capture their attention." The teacher looked puzzled. "But they seem completely engaged already. I've never seen them this focused and excited about learning." "Oh, absolutely," Clara said quickly. "I'm just thinking about scalability, about how to reach even more kids with these important messages. Sometimes traditional education approaches, even really good ones, can benefit from some modern enhancements." There was that word again. Traditional. And there was the same underlying assumption that had been driving me crazy for years, that newer automatically meant better, that anything developed by older educators was inherently outdated and in need of improvement. I watched Clara continue her documentation work, taking photos of Jazz leading the children through seed planting activities, capturing images of kids' faces as they discovered something new about plant growth or ecosystem relationships. Her technical skills were impressive, and I could see why the conservatory staff valued her contributions. But I could also see what Jazz had been talking about. There was a distance in Clara's engagement, a sense that she was observing and analysing rather than truly participating in the community of learning that had developed around these programs. After the school group left, I approached Jazz in the education classroom. She was cleaning up from the morning's activities, wiping down tables and organising supplies with the efficient movements of someone who'd done this many times before. "How did that go?" I asked, settling into one of the small chairs designed for elementary school students. "Really well," Jazz said, her face lighting up with the satisfaction of a successful teaching experience. "Those kids were so engaged, especially when we got to the hands-on planting. There's something magical about watching a child realize that they can actually grow food, that they have the power to nurture life." I noticed Clara was here documenting the program. Jazz's expression became more neutral. "Yeah, she's been doing that for several months now, building a portfolio of our educational initiatives for grant applications and promotional materials. How do you feel about her documentation work?" Jazz paused in her cleaning and looked at me directly. "Can I be honest with you? It makes me a little uncomfortable. Not the photography itself. We need good documentation of our programs. But the way she talks about the work, like it's raw material that needs to be refined and improved rather than something valuable in its own right." "What do you mean?" "Well, like today, after you left, she spent about 20 minutes talking to me about ways we could enhance the programming. More digital components, interactive apps that could supplement the hands-on activities, social media integration that would help kids share their experiences online." Just sat down in the chair next to mine. And I kept thinking, but the kids were completely engaged. They were learning, they were excited, They were making connections between what they were doing here and their lives at home. Why do we need to fix something that's already working? This confirmed what I'd been observing, but it also raised larger questions about Clara's approach to environmental education. There was nothing wrong with incorporating technology into educational programming, but there was something troubling about the assumption that successful programs needed technological enhancement to be truly effective. Jazz, can I ask you something? In your interactions with Clara, has she ever mentioned her personal connections to the conservatory? Any relationships with long-time volunteers or supporters? Jazz shook her head. No, never. She presents herself as someone who discovered the conservatory through her professional interest in environmental communications. Why, I was about to answer when I heard Clara's voice in the hallway, talking to someone on her phone. Jazz and I both fell silent, listening as Clara's conversation became audible through the open classroom door. Yes, I've been documenting their educational programs for about 6 months now, Clara was saying. It's been fascinating to see how these community-based organizations operate. Very grassroots, very traditional in their approach, but there's definitely potential for modernization. She paused, presumably listening to the person on the other end of the conversation. Oh, absolutely. I think there are significant opportunities to bring more contemporary educational methodologies to this kind of programming. The current approach is very much rooted in older models of environmental education, lots of hands-on activities, very tactile and sensory-based. It works for some learners, but I think we could reach a much broader audience with more sophisticated communication strategies. Jazz and I exchanged glances. What Clara was describing as older models and traditional approaches were actually cutting-edge educational methodologies based on decades of research into how people learn best. The hands-on, sensory-based approach she was dismissing was exactly what contemporary education research recommended for environmental learning. The key is building credibility with the academic community while bringing fresh perspectives to the work. Clara continued, I've been careful to learn from the existing programs while developing my own vision for how community environmental education could evolve. I felt my chest tighten with anger. Clara was talking about my work, programs I had developed, approaches I had pioneered, as if they were outdated methods that she had graciously studied before developing superior alternatives. Yes, I'm hoping to transition into nonprofit leadership within the next year, Clara said. There's a position with the Midwest Environmental Action Network that would be perfect, a chance to bring strategic communications expertise to an established organization and help them reach new audiences. Jazz looked at me with wide eyes, clearly understanding now why I'd been asking about Clara's work at the conservatory. Clara was using her volunteer position as a credential-building exercise, gaining experience and developing professional talking points that would help her land exactly the kind of job she'd asked me to help her get done. As Clara's conversation continued, it became clear that she was talking to someone who might have connections to the mean selection committee, possibly even someone involved in the hiring process. She was positioning herself as an innovative voice who could modernize traditional environmental education approaches that, ironically, she'd learned by studying my own programs. I think the environmental movement needs more people who understand contemporary communication strategies, Clara was saying. There's so much valuable work being done by older generation environmental educators, but it's often not packaged in ways that resonate with today's audiences. That's where someone with my background can add real value. The condescension in her voice was unmistakable now. She wasn't just dismissing my work as outdated, she was actively using it as a stepping stone to position herself as a more sophisticated alternative. When Clara's conversation ended and her footsteps faded down the hallway, Jazz and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Helen, Jazz said finally, I think I understand now why Clara never mentioned knowing you personally. She's been building her professional narrative around being someone who can improve upon existing environmental education approaches. If people knew she was learning from you, it would undermine that story. I nodded, feeling a deep sadness settle over me. This wasn't just about professional recognition or credit for my work. This was about a fundamental dishonesty in how Clara was presenting herself to the environmental community. She was claiming expertise and insight that she'd gained by studying my programs while simultaneously positioning those same programs as outdated and in need of improvement. Jazz, I need to ask you for another favor. Can you help me understand exactly what Clara has been working on here? What programs she's documented, what materials she's developed, what connections she's made? Of course, Jazz said immediately. But Helen, what are you planning to do with this information? I stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the conservatory's community garden plots. Outside, I could see neighbours working in their assigned spaces, tending to vegetables and flowers that would feed their families and beautify their neighbourhood. This was what environmental action looked like at its most basic level. People caring for the land and each other, building resilience and community one plant at a time. I don't know yet, I said honestly, but I think it's time I had a serious conversation with my son about the woman he's planning to build a life with. That afternoon, I called Evan and asked him to come over for dinner. Just the two of us, I said. No need to bring Clara. I wanted to cook for him, to spend some quiet time together like we used to do before Clara became such a constant presence in our lives. He agreed readily, sounding pleased by the invitation. It's been too long since we've had one of our Sunday dinners, he said. I'll bring wine, as I prepared Arthur's favourite pot roast recipe, the same one I'd made for Clara's first visit to our house. I tried to figure out how to approach the conversation I needed to have with my son. How do you tell someone you love that the person they're planning to marry has been systematically undermining and disrespecting you? How do you explain that their partner has been using your professional expertise while publicly dismissing it as outdated? The kitchen filled with the comforting smells of herbs and slowly braising meat, scents that brought back decades of family dinners and holiday celebrations. This house had seen so many conversations over the years, arguments and reconciliations, celebrations and sorrows, the ongoing work of maintaining relationships across generations and through changing circumstances. Tonight would be one of the most difficult conversations I'd ever had within these walls. But it was also one of the most necessary. Evan arrived at 6 o'clock sharp, carrying a bottle of red wine and wearing the slightly rumpled look of someone who'd come straight from work. He'd inherited Arthur's tendency to lose himself in technical problems, and I could see the lingering concentration in his eyes as he transitioned from code and algorithms to family dinner. Something smells incredible in here, he said, kissing my cheek and hanging his jacket on the back of the kitchen chair, the same chair Clara had sat in yesterday morning when she'd asked for my help. Arthur's pot roast, I said, stirring the vegetables that were simmering alongside the meat. I thought we could use some comfort food tonight. Evan smiled, the expression transforming his serious face into something younger and more relaxed. You know, I was thinking about Dad while I was driving over here. How he used to insist on carving the roast himself, even though you were obviously better at it. He liked the ceremony of it, I said, remembering Arthur's careful attention too. The angle of each slice, the way he'd arranged the meat on the platter with the pride of someone presenting a work of art. He said cooking might be science, but serving was performance. We fell into the comfortable rhythm of meal preparation that we'd established over the years since Arthur's death. Evan opened the wine while I finished the vegetables, and we talked about his current project at work, my recent classes at the conservatory, the unusually warm weather we'd been having. It felt like the old days, before Clara had become such a dominant presence in our conversations. But as we sat down to dinner, I could feel the weight of what I needed to discuss pressing against the comfortable domesticity of the moment. I'd been rehearsing different approaches all afternoon, trying to find a way to raise the subject of Clara's request without immediately putting Evan on the defensive. Evan, I said, finally, after we'd settled into the meal and conversation had found its natural pauses. Clara came to see me yesterday morning. He looked up from his plate, surprise flickering across his face. She did. She didn't mention that. What did she want to talk about? She asked me for a professional reference letter. For a job application. Evan's surprise deepened. A reference letter, but I thought you didn't really. I mean, you work in different fields, don't you? The innocent confusion in his voice broke my heart a little. After 6 years of watching Clara systematically dismiss my expertise, Evan genuinely didn't understand why she would want my professional endorsement. He'd internalized her narrative about my work being outdated, my connections irrelevant to the modern environmental movement. Actually, I said carefully, the position she's applying for is quite relevant to my background. It's a director role at the Midwest Environmental Action Network, overseeing community outreach and education programs. Evan's eyebrows rose. That's a pretty prestigious organization. Clara's been talking about wanting to get into nonprofit work, but I didn't realize she was aiming that high. He paused, taking a sip of wine. But Mom, I'm still not sure I understand why she'd ask you for a reference. No offense, but you've been retired for years. Do you even know anyone in that world anymore? There it was, the assumption that had been poisoning our relationship for years. The idea that retirement meant irrelevance, that stepping away from university life meant stepping away from professional influence and connections. It was exactly the attitude that Clara had been reinforcing through her subtle comments and dismissive behavior. Evan, I said gently, the director of Mean is Dr. Elise Navarro. She and I have been colleagues and friends for over 30 years. We co-authored papers together, served on conference planning committees, supported each other through the challenges of being women in environmental science. We still have lunch at least once a month. Evan's fork paused halfway to his mouth. You're friends with the director of Mean? Close friends. Elise was at your father's funeral. She's been to this house for dinner dozens of times over the years. You've met her, though you might not remember. You were usually more interested in the dessert table than the academic conversations. I could see Evan processing this information, trying to reconcile it with the narrative he'd absorbed about my post-retirement irrelevance. But Clara said, she's been talking about this position as if it were completely out of reach. Like she'd need incredible credentials and connections to even be considered. She would need incredible credentials and connections, I said. A reference letter from me would carry significant weight with the selection committee. Probably more weight than any other recommendation she could get. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Evan set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, his analytical mind clearly working through the contradictions between what Clara had told him and what he was learning now. Mom, he said slowly, if you have that kind of influence with this organization, why didn't Clara mention your connection when she told me about the position? This was the question I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. How do you explain to your son that his partner has been systematically hiding information that would reveal her disrespect for you? I think, I said carefully, that Clara has been selective about what aspects of my background she chooses to acknowledge. What do you mean? I took a deep breath, knowing that what I said next would fundamentally change how Evan understood the dynamics in our family. Evan, for the past 6 years, Clara has made it very clear that she considers my work outdated, my expertise irrelevant to contemporary environmental issues. She's referred to my research as traditional approaches that need to be modernized. She's suggested that my involvement in current environmental initiatives is more about keeping emeritus professors busy than about meaningful contribution. Evan's face was growing troubled. Mom, I think you might be misinterpreting. Let me finish, I said gently. Yesterday, I learned that Clara has been volunteering at the Garfield Park Conservatory for the past 6 months, working on exactly the kind of community-based environmental education programs that I've been developing there for 7 years. She's been documenting my approaches, learning from my methods, building credentials based on work that she's simultaneously described as outdated. That can't be right, Evan said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Clara volunteers at the conservatory. She's never mentioned that. She's never mentioned it because acknowledging that connection would undermine the professional narrative she's been building. She wants to position herself as someone who can bring fresh, modern perspectives to environmental education. It's harder to make that claim if people know she's been learning from the supposedly outdated approaches she's criticizing. Evan was quiet for a long time, staring down at his plate. When he looked up again, there was something pained in his expression. Mom, even if what you're saying is true, even if Clara has been dismissive of your work. Doesn't she deserve a chance to pursue her career goals? I mean, if she's qualified for this position, if she could do good work there, shouldn't that matter more than personal conflicts? It was such a thoughtful question, and so very much like Evan to try to find the fair and balanced perspective, even when confronted with uncomfortable truths. He'd inherited Arthur's instinct for seeking justice, and my tendency to consider multiple angles of complex problems. You're right that personal conflicts shouldn't interfere with professional decisions, I said. But Evan, this isn't just about hurt feelings or generational misunderstandings. This is about fundamental honesty and integrity. I stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, where I'd left a folder of materials I gathered from the conservatory. Clara has been building her qualifications for this position by studying and documenting programs that I developed. She's gained experience and expertise through her volunteer work with approaches that she publicly dismisses as traditional and outdated. She's positioned herself as an innovative voice who can modernize environmental education while using methods she learned from supposedly old-fashioned educators. I handed Evan some of the promotional materials Clara had developed for the conservatory, materials that showcased her talent but also demonstrated how she'd been building her credentials. Look at this work, Evan. It's genuinely impressive, but it's also based on educational philosophies and approaches that she's spent years telling you and me are outdated. Evan studied the materials with the same focused attention he brought to debugging code or solving technical problems. I could see him beginning to recognize the contradictions, the way Clara had been benefiting from my expertise while publicly undermining it. There's something else, I said, returning to my chair. Yesterday, while I was at the conservatory, I overheard Clara on a phone call. She was talking to someone about the main position, describing how she'd been learning from existing environmental education programs while developing her own vision for how the work could be modernized. She specifically mentioned bringing contemporary educational methodologies to replace older models that are very traditional in their approach. She was talking about your programs. She was talking about my programs without acknowledging that they were my programs. She was positioning herself as someone who could improve upon work that she'd learned by studying my methods, while hiding the fact that she'd learned from me. Evan set down the materials and rubbed his temples. This is ... This is really hard to process. I mean, I know Clara can be a little intense ... about her career ambitions. And I know she sometimes doesn't relate well to your generation's way of doing things. But what you're describing sounds like something much more serious. It is something much more serious, I said quietly. Evan, I need you to understand that this isn't about an older woman feeling threatened by a younger woman's success. This is about someone building their professional reputation through dishonesty and disrespect. Someone who's been systematically undermining the very expertise they're now asking me to endorse. The silence that followed felt different from our earlier pauses in conversation. This was the silence of someone's worldview shifting, of comfortable assumptions being challenged by uncomfortable truths. Mom, Evan said, finally, what are you going to do about the reference letter? It was the question that had been haunting me since Clara left my kitchen yesterday morning. But as I sat there looking at my son, seeing the conflict and confusion in his face, I realized something important. This decision wasn't just about Clara and me. It was about what kind of values I wanted to model, what kind of integrity I wanted to demonstrate, what kind of legacy I wanted to leave. I don't know yet, I said honestly. But I think I need to have a conversation with Clara first, a real conversation where we both speak honestly about what's been happening between us. Evan nodded slowly. I think that's probably a good idea. But Mom, can I ask you something? If Clara apologizes, if she acknowledges how she's treated you and commits to changing, would you consider writing the letter? It was such a generous question, so full of hope for reconciliation and growth, but it also revealed how much Evan still didn't understand about the situation we were dealing with. Evan, I said gently, this isn't just about apologies. This is about a pattern of behavior that goes to the core of Clara's character. Someone who would build their career by secretly studying and appropriating methods they publicly dismiss. Someone who would hide professional connections to maintain a false narrative about their own innovations. Those aren't mistakes that can be fixed with an apology. Those are choices that reveal something fundamental about how someone operates in the world. Evan was quiet for a long time, clearly struggling with the implications of what I was telling him. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes that reminded me so much of Arthur's, thoughtful, pained, but ultimately committed to truth over comfort. Mom, I need to talk to Clara about all of this. I need to hear her side of the story. Of course you do, I said. But Evan, I need you to think carefully about what her responses tell you, not just about this situation, but about the kind of person you're planning to build a life with. After Evan left that evening, I sat in Arthur's chair and tried to process everything that had happened. The conversation with my son had been difficult, but necessary, and I could see that it had opened his eyes to dynamics in our family that he'd been missing or ignoring, but it had also clarified something important. For me, this situation with Clara wasn't just about whether to write a reference letter. It was about standing up for values that I'd spent my entire career defending: honesty, integrity, respect for knowledge and expertise regardless of its source. Tomorrow, I would call Clara and ask her to come back to my house. We would have the honest conversation that should have happened years ago. The conversation where we both stopped pretending that subtle disrespect and professional appropriation were acceptable parts of family dynamics. And then I would decide what kind of legacy I wanted to leave, not just for my own career, but for the environmental movement that I devoted my life to serving. I called Clara early Saturday morning, before I could lose my nerve or talk myself out of what needed to be done. She answered on the second ring, and I could hear the hope in her voice when she realized it was me. Helen, thank you so much for calling. I've been thinking about our conversation all week, and I wanted you to know how much I appreciate you considering my request to Clara. I interrupted gently. I'd like you to come over this afternoon so we can have a proper conversation about all of this. There are some things we need to discuss before I can make any decision about the reference letter. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Of course. What time would work for you? 2:00, and Clara, I think it would be best if Evan weren't here for this conversation. This needs to be between you and me. Another pause, longer this time. Okay, I'll be there at 2. I spent the morning preparing for what I knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. I pulled together my professional portfolio, the thick binder that contained decades of published papers, conference presentations, awards, and recognition letters from colleagues around the world. I hadn't looked through it in years, but as I flipped through the pages, I was reminded of the substantial body of work I'd built over my career. There were papers on urban ecosystem management that had influenced policy in a dozen cities, research on community-based environmental education that had been cited hundreds of times by other scholars, documentation of innovative approaches to public engagement with environmental science that had become standard practice in universities across the country. This wasn't the work of someone whose approaches were outdated or traditional. This was cutting-edge research that had shaped contemporary environmental science and education. And it was work that Clara had been studying and appropriating while simultaneously dismissing it as irrelevant to modern environmental challenges. I also gathered the materials Jazz had helped me collect about Clara's work at the conservatory, the promotional materials she'd developed, the documentation of her volunteer activities, the timeline of her involvement that directly coincided with my own program development there. The evidence was clear and damning. Clara had been building her professional credentials by learning from my work, while hiding that connection to maintain her narrative about bringing fresh perspectives to traditional approaches. At 2:00 sharp, Clara knocked on my door. She was dressed professionally, but not formally. Dark jeans, a soft sweater, minimal makeup. She looked nervous and slightly exhausted, as if she hadn't been sleeping well since our conversation on Thursday. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, she said as I led her into the living room. I'd decided against the kitchen this time. This conversation needed the weight and formality that the living room provided, with its walls of books and Arthur's imposing reading chair. Would you like coffee? I offered. No, thank you. I think I've had enough caffeine this week too. How are a small city I smiled despite everything. It was the first genuinely human moment we'd shared in years, a glimpse of the person underneath the professional polish. We settled into chairs facing each other across the coffee table where I'd arranged my portfolio and the conservatory materials. Clara's eyes immediately went to the stack of documents, and I could see her trying to figure out what I'd assembled there. Clara, I began, before we talk about the reference letter, I think we need to have an honest conversation about our relationship over the past 6 years. I don't think we've ever really talked directly about the dynamics between us, and I think that's contributed to some misunderstandings. Clara shifted in her chair, her professional composure slipping slightly. I appreciate that, Helen, I know. We haven't always click. The way I might have hoped when Evan and I first started dating. Is that how you describe it? That we haven't clicked? She was quiet for a moment, clearly considering how much honesty this conversation could bear. I think we sometimes have different perspectives on things. Different approaches to environmental work, different communication styles, different ideas about how to engage with contemporary challenges. It was such a careful, diplomatic response, and it told me everything I needed to know about how Clara viewed our relationship. Even now, in a conversation I'd explicitly described as needing honesty, she was still couching her attitudes in professional language that avoided direct acknowledgement of her behavior. Clara, I said gently, I'm going to be very direct with you, because I think this conversation requires that level of honesty. For 6 years, you've treated me as if my work and expertise are outdated and irrelevant to contemporary environmental challenges. You've dismissed my research as traditional approaches that need to be modernized. You've suggested that my current involvement in environmental education is more about keeping retired professors busy than about meaningful contribution to the field. Clara's face flushed, but she didn't immediately deny what I was saying. Helen, if I've given that impression, it wasn't intentional. I have enormous respect for your career and your contributions to environmental science. Do you? I asked, because your actions suggest otherwise. I reached for the portfolio and opened it to a paper I'd published 3 years earlier on innovative approaches to urban environmental education. This paper has been cited 47 times by other researchers. It's influenced environmental education policy in 8 major cities. The approaches I developed are being implemented in universities across the country as examples of best practices in community engagement. Clara looked at the paper, and I could see recognition flickering in her eyes. She'd probably encountered my work during her research for the conservatory projects, though she might not have connected it to me specifically. My most recent research, I continued, flipping to another section of the portfolio, focuses on methods for translating complex environmental science into accessible community education programs. It's exactly the kind of work that Mean specializes in. Exactly the kind of expertise they're looking for in their new director. Helen, I never meant to imply that your work wasn't valuable. Clara, let me show you something else. I reached for the conservatory materials and spread them across the coffee table. Clara's promotional designs, her documentation of educational programs, her volunteer activity reports, all of it laid out like evidence in a case I was building. These are beautiful materials, I said. And I meant it. You're genuinely talented at this work. But Clara, do you recognize the educational approaches that these materials are documenting? She looked down at her own work, confusion and dawning concern crossing her face. The hands-on, sensory-based learning methods you've been documenting at the conservatory, those are based on research I published 5 years ago on embodied learning in environmental education. The community partnership approaches you've been promoting, those come directly from a program model I developed and piloted in Westside neighborhoods. The frameworks you've been using to translate complex ecological concepts into accessible language, I literally wrote the book on those methods. Clara's face had gone very pale. ID and single quotes I mean, when I started volunteering at the conservatory, they trained me on their educational approaches. I didn't research the theoretical background double quotes, but you did present yourself as someone who could bring innovative approaches to traditional environmental education, didn't you? You did position yourself as having fresh perspectives that could modernize outdated methods. She was quiet for a long time, staring down at the materials spread across the table. When she looked up again, there were tears in her eyes, but also something that looked like defiance. Helen, even if what you're saying is true, even if I've been unaware of the connections between your work and the programs at the conservatory, that doesn't change the fact that I've been doing good work there. I've contributed valuable skills. I've helped them reach new audiences. I've brought professional expertise that they needed. You have, I agreed. And I'm not trying to diminish your contributions. But Clara, you've been building your qualifications for positions like the mean directorship by learning from and documenting work that you've simultaneously been dismissing as traditional and outdated. Don't you see the problem with that? I think you're making this more complicated than it needs to be, Clara said. And there was an edge to her voice now. The environmental movement needs people with diverse skill sets and perspectives. It doesn't matter where those skills come from as long as they're effective. It was exactly the response I'd been expecting and dreading, even when confronted. With clear evidence of her behavior, Clara was defending herself by reframing the issue in terms of practical outcomes rather than ethical considerations. Clara, it does matter where skills come from when you're building your professional reputation. By hiding those sources, it does matter when you're positioning yourself as an innovative voice while secretly learning from the supposedly outdated approaches you're criticizing. Helen, I think you're taking this all too personally. This isn't about you or your feelings. This is about my career and my ability to contribute to important environmental work. And there it was, the fundamental disconnect that had been driving our conflicts for years. Clara genuinely didn't understand that professional integrity and personal respect were connected, that you couldn't build a career through dishonest means and expect it not to reflect on your character. Clara, I said quietly, let me ask you something. When you started volunteering at the conservatory, did you know that I'd been working there for 7 years? She hesitated just long enough to tell me the answer. Yes, I knew. And when you were documenting the educational programs there, did you realize that many of them were based on approaches I'd developed? Another hesitation. I suspected there might be connections to your work. And when you were building your professional portfolio based on that volunteer experience, did you ever consider acknowledging those connections? Clara's composure finally cracked completely. What was I supposed to do, Helen? You've made it clear from day one that you don't think I'm good enough for your son. You've been cold and dismissive and judgmental from the first time we met. You've never shown any interest in my work or my goals or my perspective on anything. Was I supposed to ask for your permission to volunteer at the conservatory? Was I supposed to credit you every time I learned something from the programs there? The raw emotion in her voice surprised me, but it also revealed something important. Clara's behavior toward me hadn't been entirely calculated. It had been defensive, a response to feeling judged and unwelcome in what she saw as my domain. Clara, I said gently, I never intended to make you feel unwelcome in this family. But I also never intended to be treated as if my life's work was irrelevant to contemporary environmental challenges. I never said your work was irrelevant. You didn't have to say it directly. You said it in 1,000 small ways over 6 years. Every time you redirected conversations when I shared stories from my career. Every time you suggested that my approaches were traditional and needed modernization. Every time you positioned yourself as bringing fresh perspectives to environmental education while hiding the fact that you were learning from my methods. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 6 years of accumulated misunderstandings and hurt feelings settling between us. Outside, I could hear the sounds of Saturday afternoon in the neighborhood, children playing, lawnmowers starting up, the ordinary rhythms of life continuing while we grappled with questions of integrity and respect. Helen, Clara said finally, what do you want from me? Do you want me to admit that I've been wrong about everything? Do you want me to acknowledge that you're the real expert and I'm just a pretender? Do you want me to give up my career ambitions? Because I've made mistakes in how I've treated you. I want you to understand that building a career through dishonesty and disrespect has consequences, I said. I want you to recognize that the expertise you've been dismissing as outdated is actually cutting-edge work that could benefit from collaboration rather than appropriation. And I want you to consider what kind of leader you want to be in the environmental movement. And if I do all that, if I acknowledge everything you're saying and commit to changing how I approach these relationships, will you write the reference letter? It was the question I'd been dreading because I still didn't have a clear answer. Part of me wanted to believe that Clara could change, that this conversation could be the beginning of a more honest and respectful relationship. But another part of me recognized that the patterns we'd established over 6 years wouldn't be easily undone, and that someone who had built their professional credentials through appropriation and dismissal might not be the right person to lead environmental initiatives that required deep respect for diverse forms of knowledge and expertise. Clara, I said, I need you to understand something. The reference letter you're asking for isn't just about helping you get a job. It's about me putting my reputation and my relationships behind your qualifications and character. It's about vouching for you to colleagues whose respect I've spent decades earning. I understand that, do you? Because the person I'd be recommending to Elise Navarro would be someone who spent 6 years studying and learning from approaches she publicly dismissed as outdated. Someone who built credentials through volunteer work while hiding professional connections that would reveal the sources of her expertise. Someone who, even when confronted with evidence of that behavior, initially defended it in terms of practical outcomes rather than ethical considerations. Clara was crying now, but quietly, tears streaming down her face without the dramatic sobs that might have been calculated to evoke sympathy. Helen, I know I've made mistakes. I know I've handled this badly. But I'm asking you to give me a chance to do better. This position at MEAN, it could be my opportunity to actually live up to the values I claim to care about. It could be my chance to build bridges instead of walls, to respect expertise instead of dismissing it. And what about Evan? I asked. What about building bridges in your own family before you try to build them professionally? I want to do that too. I want to find a way for us to work together instead of against each other. I want to learn from your expertise instead of hiding from it. The sincerity in her voice was compelling, but I'd also learned over 6 years not to trust Clara's ability to maintain changed behavior once the immediate crisis had passed. Good intentions were easier to claim than sustained patterns of respect and integrity. Clara, I need to think about all of this. This conversation has clarified some things for me, but it's also raised new questions about how we move forward. She nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks. How much time do you need? The application deadline is still Friday. I'll let you know by Wednesday. But Clara, I want you to think carefully about what kind of leader you want to be. What kind of colleague? What kind of family member? Because those things are all connected. The way you treat people in private relationships affects your ability to lead effectively in professional contexts. As I walked Clara to the door, she turned back to me one more time. Helen, regardless of what you decide about the letter, I want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for making you feel dismissed and disrespected. I'm sorry for not acknowledging your expertise and your contributions. And I'm sorry for building walls between us when I should have been building bridges. After she left, I sat in Arthur's chair and tried to process everything that had happened. The conversation had been difficult, but necessary, and it had revealed both the depth of the problems between us and the possibility, however slim, that those problems might be addressed. But it had also clarified the stakes of my decision. About the reference letter, this wasn't just about helping Clara achieve her career goals or punishing her for past behavior. This was about what kind of values I wanted to support in the environmental movement, what kind of leadership I believed that movement needed. Tomorrow, I would call Elise and have a conversation about MEAN's mission, their values, and what they were really looking for in their new director. And then I would decide what kind of legacy I wanted to leave, not just for my own career, but for the future of environmental activism. Sunday morning found me in my garden before dawn, working by the light of the back porch lamp to transplant seedlings I'd been nurturing indoors through the winter. There's something about having my hands in soil that helps me think through difficult problems, and I had the most difficult decision of my life to make. The conversation with Clara had stayed with me all night. replaying in fragments that revealed new layers of complexity each time I examined them. Her tears had seemed genuine, her apologies sincere, her commitment to change heartfelt. But I'd also seen how quickly she'd defaulted to defensiveness when challenged. How readily she'd reframed ethical questions in terms of practical outcomes. As I carefully separated the root systems of tomato seedlings and settled them into larger parts, I found myself thinking about growth and transformation. These plants had started as tiny seeds, developed into seedlings under controlled conditions, and were now ready to face the challenges of the larger world. But that transition required careful attention to their needs, appropriate support systems, and realistic expectations about their ability to thrive in new environments. Was Clara ready for the kind of leadership role she was seeking? Did she have the integrity and wisdom that environmental work required? Or was she still in the seedling stage, needing more time and support before she could handle the responsibilities of directing a major organization? I was still wrestling with these questions when my phone rang. The display showed Elise's number, and I realized she was calling at the same time we'd spoken every Sunday morning for the past 15 years. "Helen," she said without preamble, "I've been thinking about our conversation the other day. About the reference letter you mentioned. Can you tell me more about this candidate you're considering recommending?" I set down my gardening tools and walked to the bench Arthur had built along the back fence. The morning air was crisp, but held the promise of spring warmth, and I could hear the first birds beginning their dawn chorus in the old oak tree. "It's complicated, Elise. The candidate is someone I know personally, someone whose technical skills I can vouch for, but whose character and integrity I have serious questions about." "That's not usually your style, Helen. You're one of the most perceptive judges of character I know. What's making this decision so difficult?" I took a deep breath and tried to find a way to explain the situation without revealing too many personal details. "This person has genuine talent for environmental communications and has been doing impressive work in community education. But they've also been building their credentials through methods that raise serious questions about their honesty and respect for others' expertise. Can you be more specific?" "They've been studying and appropriating approaches developed by other environmental educators while publicly dismissing those same approaches as outdated and traditional. They've positioned themselves as bringing innovative perspectives to environmental education while hiding the fact that their innovations are actually based on existing work they've been learning from." There was a long pause on Elise's end of the line. "Helen, that's exactly the kind of behavior we're trying to avoid in environmental leadership. The movement has been damaged too many times by people who prioritize their own advancement over collaborative approaches to the work." "I know, that's why I'm struggling with this decision. But you said they have genuine talent. Is there any evidence that they recognize the problems with their approach? Any indication that they're capable of growth and change?" I thought about Clara's tears yesterday, her apologies, her commitment to doing better, but I also thought about the 6 years of behavior that had preceded those promises, the defensive responses when challenged, the tendency to reframe ethical questions in terms of practical outcomes. "There's some evidence of recognition and remorse," I said carefully. "But there's also a pattern of behavior that suggests these issues go deeper than simple mistakes or misunderstandings. Helen, can I ask you something? Is this person's application already strong enough that they're likely to be seriously considered even without your reference?" It was a question that got to the heart of my dilemma. Clara's application was impressive, her marketing experience, her volunteer work at the conservatory, her portfolio of community engagement projects. With the right references from her corporate clients and conservatory colleagues, she might, well, be competitive for the position even without my endorsement. "Probably," I admitted. "They have strong credentials and relevant experience. My reference would certainly help, but it might not be essential for their candidacy." "Then let me ask you this. Setting aside the personal dynamics, do you think this person would be effective in the role? Do you think they could do good work for environmental causes, even if their path to the position has been ethically questionable?" It was the hardest question Elise could have asked, because it forced me to separate my personal hurt and disappointment from my assessment of Clara's potential as an environmental leader. And the honest answer was complicated. They could be effective, I said slowly. They have real talent for translating complex environmental concepts into accessible communications. They understand social media and contemporary marketing strategies in ways that could help environmental organizations reach new audiences. But Elise, environmental leadership requires more than technical skills. It requires integrity, humility, respect for diverse forms of knowledge and expertise. I'm not sure this person has demonstrated those qualities. No, Elise said thoughtfully. Those qualities are essential. We've seen too many talented people damage environmental organizations because they lack the character to handle leadership responsibilities ethically. We talked for another 20 minutes about MEAN's mission, their current challenges, and the kind of leadership they needed to navigate an increasingly complex environmental landscape. As the conversation continued, I found myself thinking not just about Clara's qualifications, but about my own responsibilities as someone with influence in the environmental community. Did I have an obligation to protect organizations like mine from leaders who might prioritize personal advancement over collaborative approaches to environmental work? Or did I have a responsibility to support people's growth and development, even when their past behavior had been problematic? After I hung up with Elise, I spent the rest of the morning walking through my neighborhood, following the familiar routes that Arthur and I had explored together for decades. The streets were quiet on this Sunday morning, with only occasional joggers and dog walkers sharing the sidewalks with me. As I walked, I found myself thinking about the environmental movement's history, about the generations of activists and researchers who had built the foundation for contemporary environmental work. Many of them had been older voices like mine, people whose contributions were often overlooked or dismissed by younger activists eager to distinguish themselves as innovative and current. But I also thought about the young people I'd worked with over the years, students like Jazz who brought fresh energy and perspectives to environmental challenges, who combined respect for existing knowledge with creative approaches to new problems. The movement needed both continuity and innovation, both wisdom and energy. The question wasn't whether the environmental movement needed young leaders like Clara. It absolutely did. The question was what kind of young leaders it needed. Those who built their careers by appropriating and dismissing existing work, or those who honored and learned from previous generations while bringing their own insights to the challenges ahead. When I returned home, I found Evan sitting on my front porch, holding 2 cups of coffee from the cafe down the street. He looked like he hadn't slept much, his hair rumpled and his clothes wrinkled as if he'd been wearing them since yesterday. I brought peace offerings, he said, holding up one of the cups. I figured you might need caffeine after everything that's been happening. I accepted the coffee gratefully and unlocked the front door. How long have you been sitting out here? About an hour. I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me after our conversation on Friday, but I needed to talk to you about Clara. We settled into the living room, where the materials from yesterday's conversation with Clara were still spread across the coffee table. Evan's eyes went immediately to the documents, and I could see him taking in the evidence of Clara's volunteer work at the conservatory. I talked to Clara yesterday after she got back from seeing you, he said. She told me about your conversation, about the things you discovered about her work at the conservatory. What did she tell you? Everything, I think. About how she'd been learning from your approaches while dismissing them as traditional. About how she'd hidden her connection to you from her colleagues there. About how she'd been building her credentials for positions like the main job while positioning herself as someone who could modernize supposedly outdated methods. Evan set down his coffee cup and rubbed his face with both hands. Mum, I owe you an enormous apology. I've been blind to what's been happening in our family for years. I've been so focused on keeping the peace, on trying to make everyone get along, that I missed the fact that Clara was systematically disrespecting you and your work. Evan, you don't need to. Yes, I do. Because I've been complicit in this. Mum, every time Clara made a dismissive comment about your work, I should have challenged it. Every time she redirected conversations away from your expertise, I should have supported you. Instead, I made excuses and told myself it was just generational differences or communication styles. The pain in his voice broke my heart. Evan had inherited his father's instinct for fairness and harmony, qualities that made him a wonderful son and partner, but sometimes prevented him from seeing conflict clearly until it reached a crisis point. "What did Clara say when you confronted her about all this?" She cried. "A lot. She acknowledged that she'd been wrong, that she'd handled the situation badly, that she'd let her insecurities and ambitions lead her to behave in ways that were dishonest and disrespectful." Evan paused, looking directly at me. "But Mom, she also said some things that I think you need to hear." "What kinds of things?" "She said that from the very beginning, she felt like you disapproved of her, like you thought she wasn't good enough for me or smart enough to understand your work. She said she felt intimidated by your expertise and accomplishments, and that instead of asking for your guidance and mentorship, she went on the defensive and tried to prove that she didn't need your approval or support." I thought back to that first dinner 6 years ago, to Clara's polished presentation and my own nervousness about making a good impression. Had I inadvertently communicated disapproval or judgment? Had my attempts to share my expertise come across as dismissive of her? Different approaches. She said that when she started volunteering at the conservatory, she knew it was connected to your work, but she was afraid that acknowledging that connection would make it seem like she was trying to use her influence to advance her own career. So she kept it separate, told herself she was building her own credentials independent of your reputation. But she was building her credentials by learning from my work. I pointed out, "I know, she knows that too, now. But Mom, I think she genuinely didn't understand the ethical problems with that approach until you confronted her yesterday. She saw it as learning from available resources rather than appropriating someone else's work. It was possible, I supposed. Clara was young enough that she might not have fully grasped the importance of acknowledging intellectual influences and professional connections. The academic world I'd come from had strict norms about citing sources and crediting influences. But those norms weren't necessarily obvious to people from corporate backgrounds. Evan, what do you think I should do about the reference letter?" He was quiet for a long time, clearly weighing his words carefully. "Mom, I think you should do whatever feels right to you, whatever aligns with your values and your assessment of Clara's character. I don't want my relationship with her to influence your decision, and I don't want your decision to be based on trying to protect my feelings, but it will affect your relationship with her, won't it? If I refuse to write the letter, if I essentially prevent her from getting this job she wants so badly." "Maybe, but Mom, if Clara can't handle the consequences of her own behavior, if she can't accept that actions are results, then maybe she's not someone I should be building a life with anyway." The maturity in Evan's voice surprised me. Somewhere in the past few days, my son had grown up in ways that reminded me powerfully of his father. Arthur had always been able to separate personal loyalty from ethical principles, to support the people he loved while still holding them accountable for their choices. "There's something else," Evan said. "Clara asked me to give you this." He handed me an envelope with my name written in Clara's careful handwriting. Inside was a letter. Not the formal reference request she'd originally asked for, but a personal note that was clearly difficult for her to write. "Dear Helen," it began, "I know that asking you to read another letter from me is probably the last thing you want to do, but I needed to try to explain some things that I couldn't say properly in our conversation yesterday. You were right about everything. I have been dismissive of your work. I have appropriated your approaches while claiming they were outdated. And I have built my credentials through methods that were dishonest and disrespectful. There's no excuse for that behavior, and I'm not going to try to make excuses, but I want you to understand why I behave that way, not because it justifies anything, but because I think it might help you make your decision about the reference letter. From the moment I met you, I felt intimidated by your expertise and accomplishments. You had built exactly the kind of career I dreamed of having. Meaningful work that made a real difference, respect from colleagues around the world, a legacy of research and teaching that would outlast your lifetime. Instead of asking for your guidance and mentorship, instead of trying to learn from your experience, I went on the defensive. I told myself that your approaches were outdated because it was easier than admitting that I had a lot to learn from you. I positioned myself as bringing fresh perspectives to environmental work because it felt better than acknowledging that the perspectives I was bringing were actually built on foundations you and others had laid. When I started volunteering at the conservatory, I knew it was connected to your work. I should have approached you directly, should have asked for your guidance and collaboration. Instead, I kept the connection hidden because I was afraid that acknowledging it would make me seem like I was trading on your reputation rather than building my own expertise. I know now that what I was actually doing was much worse. I was benefiting from your work while refusing to give you credit for it, building my qualifications through methods that were fundamentally dishonest. Helen, I don't know if you'll decide to write the reference letter or not, and I understand that you have every reason to refuse. But I want you to know that regardless of your decision, this experience has taught me things about integrity and respect that I should have learned years ago. If you do decide to help me, I promise that I will use this opportunity to be the kind of environmental leader who honors the expertise of others, who builds bridges rather than walls, who approaches the work with humility and collaboration, rather than ambition and competition. And if you decide not to help me, I will accept that decision as the consequence of my own choices, and I will work to rebuild my professional reputation through methods that reflect the values I claim to care about. Either way, I want you to know that I'm grateful for the difficult conversation we had yesterday, and I'm sorry that it took this crisis for me to recognize how badly I've been treating someone who deserved my respect and gratitude from the very beginning. Sincerely, Clara. I read the letter twice, trying to assess the sincerity behind the words. It was well written and thoughtful, acknowledging specific problems rather than offering vague apologies. But letters were easy to write when your career was on the line. The real test would be whether Clara could sustain this level of self-awareness and commitment to change over time. What do you think? Evan asked when I finished reading. I think Clara is capable of growth and change, I said honestly. But I also think she has a lot of work to do to rebuild trust and demonstrate that these insights translate into sustained behavioral change. So you're not going to write the letter? I looked at my son, seeing Arthur's thoughtful expression in his face, the same careful consideration of multiple perspectives that had made his father such a wise partner and friend. I'm going to write a letter, I said. But it's going to be honest about both Clara's strengths and her areas for growth. It's going to acknowledge her talent while also noting the concerns I have about her professional development. And it's going to let Elise and the selection committee make their own decisions about whether Clara is ready for this level of responsibility. Evan nodded slowly. That seems fair. More than fair, actually, given how she's treated you. Evan, I want you to understand something. The decision to write this letter isn't about forgiveness or family harmony. It's about my responsibility to the environmental movement and to young professionals who are trying to build careers in this field. Clara has talent and potential, but she also has work to do. An honest assessment of both those things serves everyone's interests better than either blind support or punitive rejection. As I walked Evan to the door, he turned back to me one more time. Mum, I want you to know that regardless of what happens with Clara's job application, I'm going to work to rebuild our relationship. I'm going to make sure she understands that disrespecting you means disrespecting me. And I'm going to make sure she gets the mentorship and guidance she should have asked for years ago. After Evan left, I spent the rest of Sunday afternoon crafting the most difficult letter I'd ever written. It was honest about Clara's talents, her communication skills, her ability to translate complex concepts into accessible language, her understanding of contemporary marketing strategies. But it was also honest about my concerns, her tendency to dismiss existing expertise, her pattern of building credentials through appropriation rather than collaboration, her need for mentorship in professional ethics and integrity. The letter took me 6 drafts to get right, balancing fairness with honesty, acknowledging potential while noting areas for growth. It was the kind of reference that would give the selection committee a complete picture of Clara as a candidate, allowing them to make an informed decision about whether she was ready for the responsibilities of environmental leadership. When I finally sealed the envelope on Sunday evening, I felt a sense of resolution that had been missing since Clara first knocked on my door. I had found a way to honor my own values while also supporting Clara's potential for growth. I had written a letter that served the interests of the environmental movement while also reflecting the complexity of human relationships and professional development. Whether Clara got the job or not was now out of my hands, but I had used my influence in a way that felt ethical and responsible, and I had modeled the kind of honest assessment that environmental leadership required. 3 weeks later, I was in my garden deadheading the early spring flowers when I heard the familiar sound of Evan's car pulling into my driveway. But this time, I could hear the car doors closing, and I knew that Clara was with him. I had sent the reference letter to Elise exactly 1 week after my conversation with Clara, and in the days that followed, I'd found myself checking my phone more frequently than usual, wondering if Clara would call with updates about the hiring process. But there had been only silence from that direction, though Evan had mentioned that Clara was trying to give me space while she processed everything that had happened between us. The selection process at Mean had moved quickly. Elise had called me the previous Friday to let me know that they'd made their decision and would be announcing it early this week. She hadn't told me who they'd chosen, but there had been something in her voice that suggested the decision had been influenced by our conversations about leadership and integrity in environmental work. Now, as I heard footsteps on the flagstone path that led to my back garden, I wondered if I was about to learn the results of that decision. "Mom," Evan's voice called from the gate. "Are you back there, in the garden?" I called back, setting down my pruning shears and brushing soil from my hands. "Come on back." Evan appeared first, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing an expression that was hard to read. Clara followed a few steps behind, carrying a small potted plant and looking more nervous than I'd ever seen her. "We brought peace offerings," Evan said, holding up the wine. "And congratulations gifts." "Congratulations for what?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect what they'd come to tell me. Clara stepped forward, setting the potted plant on my garden table. It was a beautiful young orchid, the same variety as one of my prized specimens that had been struggling to recover from a recent transplant shock. "I got the job," Clara said simply. "Mean called this morning to offer me the position." I felt a complex mix of emotions wash over me: surprise, satisfaction, concern, and something that might have been pride. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite my honest assessment of her areas for growth, Clara had been selected for the position she'd wanted so badly. "Congratulations," I said, and I meant it. "That's wonderful news. When do you start?" "In 6 weeks. They want me to spend the first month shadowing the current director, learning about their programs and partnership relationships." Clara paused, looking directly at me. "Helen, I need you to know that I understand this opportunity came partly because of your reference letter. Dr. Navarro told me that your endorsement carried significant weight with the selection committee. But she also told me," Clara continued, "that your letter was the most honest and thoughtful reference she'd ever received. She said it gave them a complete picture of my strengths and areas for growth, and it helped them understand exactly what kind of support and mentorship I'd need to be successful in the role." I nodded, feeling relieved that my attempt to balance honesty with fairness had been received the way I'd intended. "What kind of support and mentorship are they planning to provide?" "Well," Clara said, and there was something almost shy in her expression now, "Dr. Navarro suggested that I might benefit from having a senior advisor from the environmental science community, someone who could help me navigate the academic relationships that is so important to me's work, someone who could mentor me in the collaborative approaches that environmental leadership requires." She paused, clearly gathering courage for whatever came next. Double quotes, "Helen, I know I have no right to ask this after everything that's happened between us, but Dr. Navarro specifically suggested that you might be willing to serve in that role. She said there was no one she'd trust more to help a young professional develop the integrity and wisdom that environmental work requires." The request took me completely by surprise. After 6 years of conflict and 3 weeks of uncertainty, Clara was asking me to become her mentor and advisor. It was either the most ironic twist imaginable or the most natural resolution to everything we'd been through. "Clara," I said slowly, "that would be a significant commitment for both of us. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of collaborative relationship?" "I think so," she said honestly. But I also think I need to prove that to you through my actions rather than just my words. What if we started small? What if I came to some of your conservatory classes, learned about your approaches firsthand instead of secretly studying them? What if we worked together on some community education projects so you could see whether I've really learned from the mistakes I've made? It was a thoughtful proposal, one that would allow us to rebuild our relationship gradually while also giving Clara the guidance she needed for her new role. But it was also a proposal that would require me to trust in Clara's capacity for growth and change. Despite the evidence of the past 6 years, there's something else, Evan said. And I could tell from his tone that this was the part of the conversation he'd been most nervous about. Clara and I've been talking about our relationship, about the dynamics in our family, about what we want to build together going forward. He took Clara's hand, and I could see the love and concern in his face. Mum, I need you to know that I'm committed to making sure our family relationships are based on mutual respect and understanding. I won't tolerate behavior that makes you feel dismissed or undervalued, regardless of who it comes from. And I need you to know, Clara added, that I want to learn from your expertise instead of competing with it. I want to be someone who honors the knowledge and experience of others instead of trying to prove that my approaches are superior. I looked at these two young people standing in my garden, surrounded by the plants and flowers that had been my companions through decades of growth and change. They were asking me to take a risk, to trust in the possibility of transformation, to invest in the relationship that had been marked by conflict and misunderstanding, but they were also offering something valuable in return, the chance to share my expertise with someone who was genuinely ready to learn, the opportunity to influence the next generation of environmental leadership, the possibility of healing family relationships that had been damaged by years of unaddressed tension. Clara, I said finally, if we're going to work together, there need to be some ground rules. Complete honesty about your background and influences when you're developing professional materials. Explicit acknowledgement of intellectual sources when you're building on others' work. And regular conversations about the ethical dimensions of environmental leadership. I understand, Clara said immediately, and I welcome all of that. I think I need that kind of guidance and accountability. And there's something else. If we're going to collaborate professionally, we need to address the personal dynamics that have been affecting our family relationships. That means honest conversations about respect and communication, commitment to addressing conflicts directly instead of letting them fester, and acknowledgement that building trust takes time and consistent behavior. Clara nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes again. Helen, I know I have a lot of work to do to earn your trust and respect. But I'm ready to do that work, whatever it takes. I studied her face, looking for signs of the defensiveness and calculation that had marked so many of our previous interactions. But what I saw instead was vulnerability, determination, and something that looked like genuine humility. All right? I said, let's try this. But Clara, I need you to understand that this isn't just about helping you succeed in your new job. This is about modeling the kind of collaborative, respectful relationships that the environmental movement needs if it's going to address the challenges we're facing. I understand, she said. And Helen, thank you. Thank you for writing the reference letter even after everything that happened between us. Thank you for giving me a chance to prove that I can do better. And thank you for being willing to work with me instead of writing me off. As we opened the bottle of wine Evan had brought and settled into the chairs around my garden table, I found myself thinking about the peculiar paths that lead to understanding and reconciliation. 6 months ago, I would never have imagined that Clara's request for a reference letter would become the catalyst for healing our relationship and developing a professional collaboration. But here we were, surrounded by the emerging life of my spring garden, talking about ways to work together instead of against each other. Clara was asking thoughtful questions about my research, showing genuine interest in my approaches to community education, and acknowledging connections she'd previously hidden or dismissed. There's something I want to show you, I said, rising from my chair and walking to the raised bed, where I'd been working on propagating new plants from cuttings. I returned with a small part containing a rooted cutting from my prized orchid, the same variety as the plant Clara had brought me. This is from the parent plant that's been in my collection for 15 years. It's finally strong enough to survive. On its own, ready to be transplanted into its own part. I handed the cutting to Clara, who accepted it with the careful attention of someone who understood the significance of the gesture. New growth from established roots, I said. That's what I'm hoping we can achieve together, building something new while honoring the foundation that's already been laid. Clara cradled the small plant in her hands, studying the delicate root system that would support its future growth. I promise I'll take good care of it, she said. And I promise I'll try to take good care of the trust you're placing in me. As the afternoon light began to fade and the air grew cooler, we moved our conversation inside to the warmth of my kitchen. Clara helped me prepare dinner, while Evan opened another bottle of wine. And for the first time in 6 years, I felt like we were functioning as a real family, not without complications or challenges, but with a foundation of mutual respect and genuine care for each other's well-being. There's something I want to ask you, Clara said as she chopped vegetables for the salad. Would you be willing to co-teach one of the community classes at the conservatory? I'd love to learn from your methods directly, and I think the participants would benefit from your expertise. It was exactly the kind of collaborative approach I'd been hoping for, and it represented a fundamental shift in how Clara understood the relationship between learning and teaching, between honoring existing knowledge and developing new approaches. I'd be happy to do that, I said, but I have a condition. Clara looked up from her chopping, eyebrows raised in question. I want Jess to be involved as well. She's been one of my most insightful collaborators at the conservatory, and I think she could teach both of us things about connecting with younger participants. That would be wonderful, Clara said immediately. I've been wanting to work more closely with Jazz. Her approaches to community engagement are really impressive. As we sat down to dinner that evening, I found myself thinking about the long journey that had brought us to this moment. 6 years of accumulated misunderstandings and hurt feelings, 3 weeks of difficult conversations and painful honesty, and now the beginning of what might become a genuinely collaborative relationship. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, and I knew it would require ongoing attention and commitment from all of us. Trust, once broken, takes time and consistent behavior to rebuild. But sitting at my kitchen table with my son and the woman he loved, planning ways to work together instead of against each other, I felt hopeful about what we might accomplish. Outside the kitchen window, my garden was settling into the peaceful rhythms of evening. The early spring flowers were beginning to close their petals for the night, and the security light in the neighbor's yard was casting gentle shadows across the raised beds where new growth was emerging from the soil. In a few weeks, Clara would begin her new job at Maine, and I would begin my new role as her mentor and advisor. Together, we would work to model the kind of collaborative, respectful relationships that environmental leadership required. We would build bridges instead of walls, honor expertise instead of dismissing it, and approach the important work of environmental protection with humility and integrity. It wouldn't be easy, and there would undoubtedly be challenges and setbacks along the way. But for the first time in years, I felt like we were moving in the right direction, toward understanding instead of conflict, toward collaboration instead of competition, toward the kind of family and professional relationships that could sustain us through whatever challenges lay ahead. As I looked around my kitchen table at these 2 young people who represented the future of environmental activism, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and hope. This was what good work looked like. Not just the research and teaching and policy development, but the patient, difficult work of building relationships that could support meaningful action in the world. Arthur would have been proud, I thought. He would have seen the wisdom in choosing grace over grudges, growth over stagnation, possibility over past disappointments. And he would have reminded me, as he always did, that my voice mattered, not just in academic circles or professional conferences, but in the intimate spaces where hearts and minds were changed, where the future was shaped one relationship at a time. The evening ended with Clara helping me clean up while Evan built a fire in the living room fireplace. As we worked together in the kitchen, Clara asked thoughtful questions about my research, and shared ideas about ways to translate academic insights into community education programs. It was the kind of conversation I'd been hoping to have with her. 4 years, substantive, respectful, genuinely collaborative. Helen, she said, as we finished drying the last of the dishes, I know, this is just the beginning. I know I have a lot to prove and a lot to learn. But I want you to know that I'm grateful for this chance to start over, to build something better between us. I'm grateful too, I said honestly. This hasn't been easy for any of us, but I think we're going to accomplish good things together. As Clara and Evan prepared to leave that evening, Clara turned back to me one more time. The orchid cutting you gave me, what's the best way to care for it as it adjusts to its new environment? I smiled, recognizing the metaphor in her question. Patience, I said, consistent care, the right balance of support and independence, and faith that with time and attention, new growth will come. After they left, I sat in Arthur's chair and looked out at my garden in the gathering darkness. Somewhere in the raised beds, new seedlings were pushing through the soil, beginning their journey toward light and growth. Somewhere in the neighborhood, other families were navigating their own complicated relationships, working to build understanding across generational and cultural divides. And somewhere in the environmental movement, young leaders like Clara were learning to balance ambition with integrity, innovation with respect for existing knowledge, personal advancement with collaborative approaches to urgent global challenges. It had been a long and difficult journey to reach this point, but I felt hopeful about what lay ahead. Not because the work would be easy, it wouldn't be, but because we were finally approaching it with the honesty, humility, and mutual respect that meaningful collaboration required. The reference letter I'd written 3 weeks ago had been about more than helping Clara get a job. It had been about modeling the kind of honest assessment that environmental leadership required, about supporting young professionals' growth while holding them accountable for their choices, about using influence responsibly in service of larger goals. Now, as I prepared for bed in the house where Arthur and I had built our life together, I felt the satisfaction of work well done. Not perfect work, none of us were perfect, but work guided by values that honored both individual growth and collective responsibility. Tomorrow, I would call Elise to discuss Clara's transition into her new role, and I would begin planning the mentorship program that would help Clara develop the wisdom and integrity that environmental work required. Tomorrow, I would start teaching Clara how to honor the expertise of others while developing her own innovative approaches, how to build bridges instead of walls, how to approach leadership with humility and collaboration. But tonight, I was content to sit in Arthur's chair and reflect on the long journey that had brought us to this moment of possibility and hope. The work would continue, as it always had, but now it would continue with renewed purpose, strengthened relationships, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that even the most difficult conflicts could sometimes be transformed into opportunities for growth and understanding. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.